The next slide shows accurately the complexity of a real nuclear power plant, which dwarfs the nuclear reactor itself, a pressurized water reactor shown at the right, that little cylindrical vessels with the control rod sticking out the top. You can barely see it buried deep in the containment dome over on the left. Such a plant is estimated to cost about $3 billion, but actual bids in the United States are reputed now to be in the range of $6 to $10 billion, perhaps linked to, and to my mind, unnecessary and undesirable government loan guarantees. A nuclear reactor in operation produces no carbon dioxide, and the steel and concrete used in construction of the plant contribute negligible carbon dioxide to the Earth's atmosphere, an important consideration in countering warming due to greenhouse gases. But with a requirement of 200 tons per year of natural uranium per reactor, 9,000 reactors would require almost 2 million tons of raw uranium per year, and the world reserve of uranium is estimated as 4 megatons, which is absurd. 2 years' supply for plants that take much longer than that to build and that will operate for 60 years. However, experience teaches us that minerals are available in far greater quantities as the concentration demanded is reduced. And the Generation 4 analysis for cost versus supply of uranium indicates that there would be 170 megatons of terrestrial uranium at a price of some $260 per kilogram, far cheaper than the saving of uranium by reprocessing. Beyond that, one of the greater failures of governments in the last decades has been the failure to determine a cost for obtaining uranium from seawater, where there are 4,500 megatons, enough for powering the 10,000 reactor world for 2,000 years. Should nuclear power plants become such an essential element of energy supply, long before we deployed 9,000 light water reactors, we would probably have a growing population of breeder reactors envisioned since the very beginning of the nuclear era. In the breeder reactor, neutron-absorbing water is replaced by a heat transfer fluid, commonly called a coolant, that absorbs few neutrons, molten sodium or lead bismuth alloy, so that not only is there a neutron left over from the fission to provide the next generation of fissions, and so to maintain the thermal power output of the reactor, but there's an additional neutron to be captured in a fertile element such as thorium or uranium-238 to replace the fissioned material. A plutonium-uranium breeder reactor,
un reattore autofertilizzante plutonio-uranio,
depleted uranium. The plutonium from its fuel would be recycled so that the greater amount of plutonium from its fuel, not much greater, would provide the next load of fresh fuel for the breeder, while the small amount of excess plutonium would contribute to fueling an additional breeder reactor. In fact, the French system was originally created with the expectation that the reprocessed plutonium would be loaded into breeder reactors. The net result for our purposes is that almost all the raw uranium is ultimately fissioned in the breeder reactor, compared with about only 0.5% in the light water reactors. And even terrestrial uranium would be enough for many centuries of operation of a breeder economy. It's important to determine soon whether costly seawater uranium for once-through reactors is cheaper than costly breeder reactors with minimal uranium demands. The spent fuel for the breeder would contain fission products, plutonium to be recycled, and transuranics. But in a fast breeder reactor, the transuranics can efficiently be burned up and in fact contribute to the power output. The intermediate case, though, as we find it in France, in which LWRs are fed by recycled plutonium, presents a difficult problem in that the transuranics are not burned in the light water reactor and pose a very substantial problem of high toxicity, large amounts of spontaneous neutron generation, and the like. In fact, plutonium recycle, as practiced in France, if the spent fuel from the mixed oxide fuel is to be disposed of in the mined geologic repository, requires just about as much repository volume as does the once-through process without recycle, which is, in addition, cheaper at present. The next slide shows a nuclear power plant site in the United States with spent fuel in interim storage. Those tall casks, about 8 meters tall, 2 of them contain all of the spent fuel from that plant for a year's operation. And here you see the entire stock of spent fuel from the Yankee reactor throughout its lifetime. The next slide shows a spent fuel reprocessing plant at Kap La-Ag with capacity of 1,600 tons of light water reactor fuel per year. It handles fuel from all of the 58 power reactors in France and has reprocessed also German and Japanese reactor fuel. Other reactor types are possible and under development, including those in which the fuel itself is microencapsulated and the tiny spherules, about 0.5 millimeter in diameter, are housed in graphite spheres or blocks. Operating probably at somewhat less output power than the current reactors, these microencapsulated fuel reactors promise improved safety in that they can be passively cooled by airflow or radiation rather than requiring emergency core cooling water. Now we turn to the world energy problem and the world energy future in which nuclear power, as I've indicated, should play a role. The next slide shows the data-rich nature of the world energy problem. This, for obvious reasons, is called a spaghetti chart. The slide indicates the estimated U.S. energy usage in 2006, totaling about 100 quadrillion BTUs, British thermal units, or about the same number, 100 exajoules, 10 to the 18 joule. On the left are the primary energy sources for the United States in that year, dominated clearly by oil, coal, natural gas, and nuclear energy. On the right is a gross categorization of unused energy and useful energy, although much of the useful energy is degraded into heat, as is the case of all of the unused energy. In the middle are aggregations of various sectors: electricity, residential, industrial, cars, freight, and aviation. Note that almost no oil is used in the United States to make electricity, and only oil feeds transport: cars, freight, and aviation. Oil is the green. The next slide is much simpler, indicating the trend in U.S. energy use per capita and per dollar of gross domestic product, GDP, for a period of 50 years. Data on the left of the vertical line, extrapolation on the right. Energy use per dollar is increasingly driven by the higher cost of energy, so we use less. But as we shall see, efficient use of energy can sometimes be achieved with savings in investment, in addition to savings in energy cost. Slide 10 broadens this to show primary energy per capita plotted against GDP per capita for various nations, with the United States at the top using more energy per capita than anybody else. The evolution over 24 years is indicated, starting there. We grow richer and poorer recently, and use about the same amount of energy per capita. Note the astonishing increase in GDP per capita over the last decade for Ireland. The next, down here, are China and, in the green, India, Brazil, Malaysia, Russia, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the growth of Russia since then. South Korea making its way up the chart.